This is key issue 3. Where is agriculture distributed? First thing we want to talk about is intensive versus extensive farming, because as we compare agriculture and the way that it's done in different places of the world, this is a category that we can break it down into, whether it's intensive, where crops are grown closer together and there's more production, there's more productivity with each unit of land, versus extensive, where more space is used and crops are more spread out. Extensive is pretty old school. Intensive can either refer to agriculture you would find in a more developed country or a less developed country, and we'll talk about how you distinguish that. But also note that this can refer to livestock, not just farming. So here are two examples of intensive. You've got intensive subsistence rice cultivation in the top left corner. That's a picture from the Philippines. I just think it's super cool looking. Notice how they maximize the land they have by creating these terraces where they would otherwise not have flat land to farm. And intensive agriculture in more developed countries, of course, is going to be more productive because of the use of technology and genetic engineering and chemical technology, as well as electronic or otherwise, what's the word? Automotive technology. Here, a drone is used to take thermal images to determine which areas of the field need more and which need less water. So it helps them to use resources more specifically or more dynamically, where it's changing from place to place and time to time. This is some intensive chicken farming. Instead of chickens just wandering around in a huge field, they are pretty much crammed in as many as you can get in one area. Now the next level of intensive agriculture might not be using soil at all. Something called hydroponics, which is not new, but it's the use of nutrients and water to grow things without having to use soil. And this opens up a whole new level of possibility. We could have farms in the middle of our cities in towers, something called vertical farming. Is that the future? I'm not one to say, but I will say we're not at a point yet where it's necessary. We still have lots of open space. Even when we talk about overpopulation, it's not that we don't have open space, it's just that we don't have the resources where we may need them. So this is a pretty cool idea, and think about how that would cut down on transit time and cut down on the energy that it takes to move plants from the farm to someone's table. It would definitely save energy that way, but the problem is, building a whole tower to grow food in is a lot more work than just growing food in a field that's already there. Geographer Derwent Whittlesey identified 11 main agricultural regions, plus an area where agriculture was non-existent. 5 of these are in developing countries, 6 are in developed countries. So we're going to go through all these, but the 5 in developing countries are pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence, wet rice dominant, intensive subsistence crops other than rice dominant, and plantation agriculture. And in developed countries, you've got mixed crop and livestock, dairying, grain, ranching, Mediterranean, and commercial gardening. Let's first talk about plantation agriculture. This is large-scale monocropping, meaning they're growing one thing of profitable products not able to be grown in Europe or the US. So these are things like coffee, sugarcane, bananas, tea, coconuts, palm oil, rubber. Either we just don't have the climate in Europe or America, or we can't grow it very well. And It utilizes cheap labor, of course, because it's going to be in a less developed country. And it also works on a very large scale. Now, there are some potential problems with this type of agriculture. You can think environmentally, when you are pulling that much of just one resource from a given area, you are going to affect the ecology of that place. When you are using the soil for the same crop over and over and over again, you're going to deplete the soil and likely be forced to pump nutrients into it, fertilizer, and fertilizer can have its own problems. There's some economic problems with this. Can the little guy compete with that large plantation farm, which may or may not be owned by someone in another country? I like to think about Nestle. Now, Nestle makes some delicious food, but they've got their they need chocolate for the stuff that they're making. They need cocoa beans, and they can't grow cocoa beans in Switzerland. So they have a lot of influence in less developed countries, like in West Africa, and their large-scale plantation operations are going to make it very difficult for a small-time farmer in Nigeria, for instance, to actually be able to compete with prices. So a lot of regions around the world we talk about as having subsistence agriculture. Now, subsistence agriculture is where you're going to find, or subsistence regions are where you're going to find shifting cultivation, pastoral nomadism, and intensive subsistence agriculture. Those different ones, whether it's rice dominant or non-rice dominant. Take a look at this for a minute. This is a good graph just to help you. If you need to pause the video to look at this longer, you can. I'm trying to go as quickly as possible. Let's talk about pastoral nomadism. I know you've always wanted to talk about it, so let's get right to it. It's a form of subsistence agriculture. Again, that's when the food you produce is really just so you can make it to the next day. It's just for your family, not to make money off of. You're not trading it, at least not very much of it. And it's based on the herding of domesticated animals. So this is a very ancient agricultural practice. It can still be found occurring today, though the number of people who live this kind of lifestyle is going down. Various approaches combine some reliance on sedentary agriculture. So sedentary means you're sticking around in one place because it's very hard to do agriculture on the go, right? They're not like dragging around pots filled with plants. They combine that with the herding of livestock, and that's where that term that we have, transhumance, comes in. Some pastoral nomads obtain grain from sedentary subsistence farmers. More commonly, women and children of a nomadic group tend to the crops at a fixed location, while the men take the animals. Nomads may hire workers to practice sedentary agriculture, or some nomads will remain in a place and cultivate the land only when rainfall is abundant. So there's lots of different ways. There's not one particular form of nomadism that these people have to prescribe to. Where are you going to find this? You're going to find this in arid and semi-arid areas. Part of the reason for that is if you could grow a lot of things really well, there's no reason to go anywhere else, right? But nomadism may have developed because people weren't able to survive just on agriculture in one area, and so they have to move around. North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia. Again, you're going to find this in places where the land doesn't have a whole lot of claim on it. You're not going to let somebody ride their camel through your house in Cordoba or through your yard. No one wants to look out and see somebody's goats grazing on their front yard. Actually, that would be kind of awesome. But in general, that thing's just not going to fly. And so areas of the world where there's a lot of land people don't care about, again, the desert and semi-desert places are going to be where you find this. Here you have a Bedouin shepherd. Some of the animals that are consistently a part of this are camels, goats, sheep, and cattle. You know that term transhumance. Make sure you remember that one. Again, that's where a pastoral nomad may do some agriculture and then during a certain part of the year take their animals somewhere else to graze because they've run out of forage. Most nomads today are being pressured into sedentary life because more and more land is being used for agriculture or mining or some other exploitation. This is in Turkey, nomads pitching tents. Shifting cultivation, this is the one that's also known as slash and burn. And that's because it's one of its distinct features. The first one being that they clear the land by slashing the vegetation, cutting it down, and then burning it. And then the second thing is that farmers grow crops on a cleared field for only a few years. When the nutrients get depleted from that soil, they move on to somewhere else. And so this is called leaving the land fallow. You got to just kind of leave it alone until the nutrients get back into that. And then you can go farm on it again. They might do this for 6 years or as many as 20 years. So obviously there's a big problem with this, and that is that there's so much land that's just being wasted. And for a growing population, this is a problem. There's all this land that you can't even use to feed people. And the other problem, of course, is that you're often burning down forest, sometimes rainforest, which is a resource that we only have so much of. Traditionally, land is collectively owned by the village. This is what allows this to continue, right? If everyone owned all their land, they would probably think twice before burning some of it down or depleting the nutrients in the soil. And so this is only going to take place in areas of the world where the population density is pretty low. But again, it's getting harder for people because so much land is now privately owned. In the past, there were smaller populations everywhere, and that means more available land. There was low physiological density, which again is comparing the number of people to arable land, and low agricultural density, which is comparing the number of farmers to arable land. But now you've got greater density. Every type of density is greater, at least in LDCs. You've got more people, so that means more farmers, and you don't have as much arable land to go around. And that gets at one of the biggest problems with shifting cultivation. Where are you going to find this? Often tropical rainforests, these are the places that don't have a lot of open spaces. You're not going to have shifting cultivation in the Great Plains because who needs to burn anything down if it's not there? Around the Amazon, the central and western regions of Africa, and in Southeast Asia. Rice is one of the crops, maize and manioc is one of the crops. Manioc, also known as cassava, that's a root which can be ground into a starch and eaten, as well as millet and sorghum in Africa. Here's the claim to fame for shifting cultivation. It occupies the largest percentage of the world's land area. That's a big deal, and it's especially a big deal when you think about how important this land is. This is the land that has trees on it. This is the land that is contributing to giving all of us around the world a better environment. Now, I do kind of have mixed feelings about when people kind of shame the people who do this and say, you can't be doing that, this is our environment. Well, that's true. It does affect all of us, but they don't have the kind of opportunities to do it another way, at least to their knowledge. We're going to look at something in class which is pretty interesting. It's a method that people have come up with to enable people to shift from shifting cultivation to another form of farming where they can reuse the same field. Now it is declining because there is a more profitable industry than just growing things, especially because developments in agriculture elsewhere have made other farms much more productive. One of the more profitable things to do is ranching and logging. So instead of burning down those trees, why not cut them down and sell the wood? Or instead of doing agriculture there, why not cut it down for ranching? So ranching, both of these still involve cutting down the forest, right? And that's problematic. But people are transitioning away so that they can make money doing something else instead of subsistence agriculture. And commercial agriculture, I already said, is more profitable, it's more productive, so it's very hard for people to compete with their small scale slash and burn agriculture against commercial agriculture. Growing population and less land, government policies and regulations saying, hey, you can't cut this down, and of course technological advancements that give people the benefit of doing agriculture another way. This shows you land clearing in Brazil, what it once was on the left versus what it looks like after clearing on the right. I like this image because it just gives a stark contrast from past to present. And this happens a lot in Brazil because people want to do more ranching. There's a lot of cowboys in Brazil. There is a lot of cattle herding, and that is reflected in the culture. They eat a lot of meat. You can go to a restaurant downtown Memphis, which is probably the most indulgent restaurant I've ever been to, Texas de Brazil, where they literally walk around with swords. It's like a buffet, but you don't have to get up. And they have all these different meats on these basically swords, and they just shave it off on your plate as much as you want. It's ridiculous, but that reflects a culture that has huge areas of land that they've cleared to allow animals to graze. Okay, we talked about the difference between intensive and extensive agriculture, but we also noted there's a difference between the two types of intensive agriculture. Whether you're in a less developed country or MDC, you're going to be more likely to subscribe to one of these. The subsistence kind feeds more than 3/4 of the world's people who happen to live in developing countries. Farmers work intensively to subsist on a parcel of land. That just gets at the term that we're using here. Most of the work is done by hand or with animals, not using machines. They use all the land that they can. Here in the United States, we do use intensive agriculture, but if we don't like the land, we're probably not going to use it. We don't farm in the mountains because we have plenty of land elsewhere and it's just too much work. Parcels of land, again, are much smaller than elsewhere in the world. You understand this. This is the common theme of agriculture and LDCs. Smaller farms, less technology, more work done by hand and with animals. Wet rice cultivation, that's the process where rice is planted on the dry land in a nursery, and then as seedlings, they move it to a flooded field to promote growth. So that's a lot of work, and you may have seen pictures of people doing this. They're squatted down the whole time. It's not a comfortable position to be in, and it's constant activity. And once it starts to grow, they got to move it somewhere else. China and India produce 1/2 of the world's rice, so they're the largest rice producers. Thailand is another really big rice producer. The United States is a really big rice producer. We export rice. We're not producing it in Alaska, but it is part of the US, so it gets to be part of the club. And one thing to know is India and China also consume a lot of the world's rice. Here is someone in the Philippines plowing a field with a water buffalo. Definitely much more productive than trying to do that just with human power, but again, much slower and less productive than using machinery. Let's talk about commercial agriculture in developed countries. And we went over those 6 main types. And all of these are connected to this concept of agribusiness. Because the family farm is not an isolated activity. It is integrated into a large food production industry. What does that mean? Even if a farm in the US is a family farm, that doesn't mean it's like a little mom and pop operation where, like I was mentioning earlier, the farmer gets up when the rooster crows and feeds the chickens, and then he goes and waters the tomatoes. Family farms can still be huge. We do have smaller farms, but we mostly have giant farms. And those farms are directly connected to the rest of the food industry. And that's why these are agribusiness. A little bit more on that. Modern commercial farming is very dependent on inputs of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. Farmers aren't, just kicking back and praying that pests don't get in their crops. They're also not just sitting around waiting for it to rain. They are using oil to make fertilizer and pesticides. Well, they're not making it, but it is required. And what agribusiness has done is it has made it very difficult for small farmers to compete. They can't buy the huge machinery which actually makes the farm more productive. They can't pay for the seeds, which actually, you might think, one seed is like another, but these huge agricultural companies like Monsanto, they take seeds into the lab and they engineer crops. And so if you're using their seeds, you have to pay them royalties on that. And you have to pay them next year. You can't just take those seeds and use them again. Fewer than 2% of the US population works in agriculture. We know this is because of a couple things. One, it's because we are very urbanized, right? It's very hard to be a farmer when you live in the middle of a city. But also, we don't need that many people working in agriculture because farmers have gotten so good at it and they have been able to use technology to fill the gap. Land also is harder to come by due to urban sprawl. And just as years have gone on, everybody claimed a piece of land. So it's not like you can easily just say, I want to be a farmer, because it takes money. Unless you inherit it or you make a lot of money doing something else, you probably can't afford to go buy a big piece of land. Though we will talk about this, land further out from the city is a lot cheaper than land that's close to the city. Okay, one of the types is mixed crop and livestock farming. The typical example devotes nearly all land area to growing crops, but then derives more than 3/4 of its income from the sale of animal products, whether that's beef or eggs from chickens or milk, usually not milk. This permits farmers to distribute the workload more evenly through the year because crops require less attention aside from planting and harvesting them. This typically involves crop rotation, which is the practice of rotating the use of different fields from crop to crop each year to avoid exhausting the soil. And the thing that makes this so different from other ones is that you have crops and livestock on the same farm, and most of the crops are fed to the animals instead of the humans. So this one makes a lot of just sense. It's logical. If you're going to raise animals, why should you pay some other farmer for the food you need for the animals? Grow that corn yourself. Grow that barley yourself. So that's mixed crop and livestock farming. Again, this one we do find in more developed countries. It's more of an old school way of doing it because it is more self-reliant. You're not as reliant on someone else. But I don't want you to get the idea that this is like an old school organic farmer. And by the way, I'll mention this again later. When I talked about agribusiness, I meant to say that agribusiness, in making it difficult for small farms to compete, has actually given that organic farm movement the push that it needs, right? Because those small farms, they can't compete with the prices of the giant farms. They can't sell their stuff for as cheap. So a lot of them have converted to be organic farms where they can have a higher price tag, but then again make people feel better about themselves for buying organic. And we'll talk about the difference between organic and non-organic and what that word actually means. Dairy farming, the most important type of commercial agriculture that you will find in the first ring outside the large cities. And that's because of transportation factors. Now, what do I mean by ring? Well, if you took a city and you thought about it in connection to the von Thunen model, it would be in the middle, and there would be a ring around it, and there would be a larger ring around that, and larger ring around all those. And the idea is that certain types of agriculture will be closer to the city, and certain types will be further from the city. That ring surrounding the city where you're going to have the milk farming, the dairy farming, that's called a milk shed. That's a term you should know. But you should also know that over the years, as technology has progressed, and we've got refrigerated trucks, and we've got interstate systems which make transportation much faster, the radius of the milk shed has increased a lot to 500 kilometers, 300 miles. So your milk could be coming from 300 miles away, whereas 100 years ago, it was going to be probably no more than 50 miles away. This is true in northeastern United States, southeastern Canada, and northwestern Europe. Dairy farmers typically sell their milk to wholesalers who later distribute it to retailers. So again, this is part of agribusiness. You're not buying it directly from the farmer. There's a whole system. And then retailers sell it to consumers. When you go into Kroger or Whole Foods or Aldi, you get it from your retailer. So this is tied to something called locational theory. And the idea is, butter and cheese are more common than milk with increasing distance from cities in the West. Okay, I just read that off my notes, and I'll be honest with you, didn't make a lot of sense. Let me just say it in a way that does make sense. Location theory, or locational theory, is going to say that the type of product that's produced is going to be either closer or further from the city based on how quickly it could spoil and how much the land that it's produced on costs. And I'll break that down for you. So milk, it can't be thousands of miles away. It's not, yeah, they could keep it in a refrigerated truck, but it's not worth it. It's not worth the cost to ship our milk all the way from Oregon, right? Your milk is going to be more local than that. Butter and cheese can come from a little bit further away because they're going to last a little longer, even though they are derived from milk. But again, those can spoil too. In the eastern United States, virtually all milk is sold to consumers because of proximity to major metropolitan areas like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Further west, most of the milk in Wisconsin, for instance, is processed into butter and cheese because, again, it can be further away and those products can last longer on their longer journey to the consumer. And we'll just end with this, an ad campaign like this one. Y'all might not be old enough to remember these, but they had all these celebrities with milk mustaches, and it said, "Got milk." That's an example of agribusiness. The farm is tied to a system. And one more thing on milk before we call it quits. Milk production in metric tons is shown here. India actually produces more milk than any other country. It's eclipsed the United States as the world's leading milk producer. You got to do something with those cows instead of eating them. All right, we'll finish key issue 3 in the next lecture.